This is Ism. Season 1, The Origins of Socialism. Paris and the Making of Modern Revolution. Ideas meet power. Prologue. One stitch at a time. The workshop smelled of scorched wool and old starch. Stiff red corsets hung from the walls like curing hides, their whalebone ribs exposed. White chemises slumped across the tables, emptied of bodies, their sleeves collapsed inward. Yellow and blue manches lay scattered across the floor like shed skins. Jeanne Deroin knew the fabric was objectively beautiful, but the sight of it turned her stomach. She hated coming back to the workshops, the cramped spaces, the heavy air that never moved, the low light that made you squint at every stitch. But it was the cold she hated most. A shiver traced up her spine as Jeanne glanced at the child working at the end of the table. She couldn't have been more than 8. Her reddened fingers made Jeanne's own hands ache with the memory of her own childhood, spent in these very same tenements. The child's crimson thread left a faint line across her blistered fingertips, like a cut waiting to open. Pulling herself out of the trance, she remembered that she had come here with a purpose. Jeanne drew a pamphlet from her bag and unfolded it. La femme libre, the free woman. She knew it wouldn't warm those little hands, but maybe one of the older women would read it. Maybe they'd share it. One woman at a time, she reminded herself. This was not going to be done overnight. Jeanne knew the power of ideas. Just a few years earlier, she'd been working the needle 14 hours a day until a stranger gave her a Saint Simonian tract and offered her kindness. That had been enough to change everything. Not all revolutions begin with gunpowder, she thought. A woman across the table glanced up from her stitching. She looked to be 40, maybe 50, her face well worn beyond her years. Her hooded eyes lingered on the words, La femme libre. That one again, she muttered, gruff but not unkind. You really think a piece of paper's going to feed my daughter? Jeanne didn't flinch. No, she said, but maybe it can stop her from ending up in this room. The woman nodded and held out her hand in acceptance. Or at least, the woman added softly, it might keep us from the streets. Jeanne recoiled at the words, but knew all too well that this was the only option for many. The woman's sunken eyes glanced down at the paper, her wrinkled face framed by the ribs of the red corset hung from the wall behind her. Suddenly, the room seemed to turn on Jeanne, and she was overcome by an urgent need to leave the workshop. The needles and shears glinted like boning knives and skinners. The fabrics hung like grotesque trophies. Jeanne gave a hurried nod to the woman, glanced once more at the young girl, and then forced herself through the threshold. As Jeanne stepped back into the night, the snow-burned air felt somehow warmer outside than in the workshop. She exhaled slowly, her breath rising like smoke beneath the fiery glow of the gas lamps. Jeanne thought of the women scattered through the city whose labor left no monuments, only ink, thread, and blisters. She shivered, shrugged her bag of papers high on her shoulder, and then carried on to the next tenement. Hi, I'm Matt Payne. Welcome to Ism. This is Paris, 1848, the red flag in spring. Part 2, the fire. The February Revolution of 1848 raised more questions than it answered. The bourgeois king, Louis Philippe, had been swept away in a sudden upheaval, the culmination of years of social unrest, economic hardship, and political resentment. A republic was then declared, but almost immediately a more unsettling question emerged. What kind of republic would this be? In the heady weeks that followed, ideas long suppressed by censorship and repression burst out into the open. Debates about equality, freedom, gender, labor, and property, once confined to pamphlets, workshops, and underground clubs, suddenly spilled into the streets. Paris entered a brief springtime of political imagination. At the center of this ferment was the emergent socialist movement. And one of the defining questions of 1848 now came into focus. Would the new republic embrace social transformation, or would it draw a line and defend property, hierarchy, patriarchy, and order against those who sought something more radical. For the first time since the French Revolution, ideas forged in 1793, when the sans-culottes pushed the Republic towards social equality, were no longer theoretical. They were about to be tested in practice. These radical currents were still nascent in 1848, not yet fully named or systematized, but together they would form the ideological seedbed of modern socialism, anarchism, and feminism. These were not isolated doctrines, but overlapping currents, united in their rejection of inherited privilege and structural inequality, even if they diverged in their visions of how society should be remade. In the months immediately following the February Revolution, these tensions remained largely political rather than violent. They played out in newly founded journals and newspapers, in crowded political clubs, and on the floor of the newly elected Constituent Assembly. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that the social question might be debated, negotiated, even resolved within the framework of the new republic. But that moment would not last. By June, the boundaries of the new moderate republic would be drawn with gunfire and barricades. Those who refused to accept their exclusion from the new order, workers, women, and radicals, would pay for it with their lives. For socialists, Paris in 1848 would not be remembered as a story of triumph, but of tragedy, a fleeting season of hope followed by brutal repression. And yet the revolution had opened a space that could not be fully closed again. The ideas forged in that brief window would shape socialism's first generation and ripple outward beyond France. And so today we will follow those thinkers as they moved through the tumults of 1848. Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, Louis Blanc, Jeanne Deroin, Eugénie Niboyet, Auguste Blanqui, and even a young Karl Marx. Together, their ideas would collide in the streets of Paris, testing the promise of the new republic and revealing the fault lines that would define the socialist tradition for generations to come. Chapter 1. Social Questions. The cause of inequality, pauperism, universal misery, and governmental embarrassments can no longer be traced to religion. Property is the grand cause of privilege and despotism. The Republican oath should be changed. Instead of, "I swear hatred to royalty," let it be, "I swear hatred to property." Property is robbery. That is the war cry of '93, the signal of revolutions. Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, 1840, What is Property? Between 1830 and 1848, the population of Paris grew by nearly 50%. Driven from the countryside by crop failures and the mechanization of farming, migrants flooded the capital in search of work. Many ended up in the overcrowded working-class neighborhoods like Faubourg Saint-Antoine and Montmartre. Landlords crammed families into collapsing tenements where rent could consume half a worker's income. Fires were common, and so were cave-ins. And this was the mid-1800s. There were no housing codes, no child labor laws, no minimum wage. Those lucky enough to find work endured 14-hour days for meager wages, quickly devoured by rent, bread, and fuel. Children as young as 4 were prized for their ability to crawl inside machines. Women earned less by default, presumed to be supplementing a husband's income, though many had no such partner. For some, sex work became a least bad option in a world of impossible choices. And Paris was not alone. In Berlin, Vienna, Lyon, Milan, and London, the working poor faced the same realities: stagnant wages, rising prices, and urban overcrowding. But Paris was unique in its density. The rich and poor did not just coexist, they collided. Gilded arcades and glittering cafes stood just blocks from the slums. Aristocrats brushed past beggars. Inequality wasn't hidden, it was the backdrop of everyday life. As poverty deepened across Europe, a new kind of political debate emerged, what would come to be known as la question sociale, the social question. How to explain and what to do about the worsening condition of Europe's working classes. Its epicenter was Paris. The social malaise of mid-19th century Europe was so widespread that every political faction had its own diagnosis. Conservatives blamed moral decay and the collapse of traditional hierarchies. Liberals argued that lingering feudal constraints were holding back the free market, which, if left alone, would lift all boats. But radicals blamed the system itself. They saw industrial capitalism not as a passing disruption, but as an engine of exploitation that demanded structural overhaul. Within this swirl of debate, a new word began to circulate, quietly at first in the cafes, workshops, and printing houses of Paris, but by 1848 it was enough to terrify kings and bankers across Europe. That word was socialism. So what did socialism even mean in its original context? It's easy to lose sight of this. We live under the shadow of 20th century totalitarianism, and it's tempting to see socialism as a top-down program of state control. But in its earliest form, it was not a doctrine, it was a movement. One way to understand it is to compare it to abolitionism. Like the fight to end chattel slavery, socialism began as a grassroots campaign to dismantle an unjust system, one rooted in suffering, inequality, and structural domination. Both movements arose from a broader 19th century culture of radical reform, fueled by the belief that human society could and must be remade. And the two movements were not unrelated. During the French Revolution in 1794, it was the Jacobins, those same radical Republicans who inspired early socialists, who first declared the emancipation of enslaved people in the French colonies. Abolitionism, socialism, feminism, these were not isolated ideologies but overlapping insurgencies against hierarchy and cruelty. To many who lived through the 1840s, they were all part of the same rising tide. So, in the years leading up to 1848, a loose network of reformers, journalists, activists, and revolutionaries struggled, often in obscurity, to imagine a society free from domination. This world had been taking shape for decades, but it accelerated sharply during the so-called Hungry 40s as economic crisis and urban poverty deepened across Europe. Paris then became the nerve center of this ferment. Exiles arrived from Germany, Italy, Poland, and beyond. Printers worked through the night, secretly distributing radical papers. Cafes doubled as debating halls. Political clubs met in back workshops and candlelit apartments. Ideas moved quickly, passed hand to hand in pamphlets, debated aloud in taverns, argued over in prison cells and exile lodgings. As inequality worsened, a question began to dominate these conversations. What was to be done about the social consequences of industrial capitalism? Out of this debate emerged a new, contested identity as those engaged in this conversation began to call themselves socialists. Some of the most influential figures of socialism's first generation came of age within this environment. Karl Marx arrived in Paris in 1843 and entered a period of intense study and debate that would shape his early thinking. And it was here that he first encountered Friedrich Engels, beginning one of the most consequential intellectual partnerships of the modern era. But in the 1840s, Marx and Engels were still marginal figures. Their influence would come later with the founding of the First International. In the years leading up to 1848, the socialist thinkers who excited and alarmed Parisian audiences most were French thinkers like Louis Blanc, who argued that the Republic had a duty to guarantee work to its citizens, and Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, whose blistering critiques of property challenged the very foundations of bourgeois society. Proudhon and Blanc each held distinct visions for how to bring about socialism and how a future society should ultimately be structured. Their competing visions offer a glimpse into the messy world of mid-19th century socialism. So let us begin with Louis Blanc, the socialist reformer. Louis Blanc, who is not to be confused with the early vanguardist Auguste Blanqui, helped pioneer the idea of social workshops, state-supported cooperatives designed to gradually replace private enterprise. In 1840, Louis Blanc published an essay, The Organization of Labor, that became quite popular amongst workers and activists in Paris. In it, he presents competition as the root evil of capitalism, arguing that capitalist competition between workers leads to starvation, wages, and unemployment, while competition between entrepreneurs ultimately leads to monopoly and what he describes as the eventual decline of the bourgeoisie. Blanc suggests that association should replace competition, and that work should be guaranteed to all families. In articulating his vision of socialism, Blanc even coined the phrase later made famous by Marx, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. And importantly, these guarantees to consistent work and a living wage were to be ensured by the government. Standing in opposition to Blanc's state-led socialism was Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, a self-taught printer from Besançon who electrified the political world with one simple declaration: property is theft. In his 1840 book, What is Property?, he argued that land and capital were not the fruits of labor, but its legalized plunder. He drew a sharp line between property and possession, defending the right of individuals to own and use what they actually worked with, while condemning absentee ownership, rent, and exploitation. From this critique flowed a radically different vision of socialism. Proudhon imagined a decentralized society built on mutual aid and voluntary cooperation, a world without bosses, without hierarchy, and ultimately without the state itself. He was the first thinker to call himself an anarchist, and his fierce insistence on autonomy and equality would leave a deep imprint on generations of radicals. In very different ways, Proudhon and Louis Blanc each helped move socialism from utopian blueprint to actual political strategy. Both believed that a just social order could be achieved without violent insurrection, through moral critique, association, reform, and the gradual reorganization of society. And in that sense, they stood apart from the insurrectionary tradition that still haunted French revolutionary politics. Proudhon's moral assault on property, wage labor, and state power inspired the growth of worker cooperatives, mutual aid societies, and people's banks, attempts to gradually build a new social order alongside and against capitalism in the state. Blanc, by contrast, sought to harness the state itself. After being elected to the provisional government following the February Revolution of 1848, he would become one of the few socialist theorists granted the opportunity to translate his ideas into actual policy. His proposal for state-supported social workshops would bring socialism directly into the machinery of the new republic. Both approaches would collide with reality in 1848, and both would leave lasting legacies, shaping not only the failures of that year, but later uprisings as well, most notably the Paris Commune of 1871. But these visions also shared a revealing blind spot. For all their commitment to equality, many of the most prominent male socialist theorists of the 1840s struggled to extend their egalitarian principles to questions of gender. Louis Blanc, for example, expressed genuine sympathy for the hardships endured by female workers and lamented the tragic necessity of sex work. Yet he largely treated politics as a male domain, rarely addressing women as independent political actors in public life. Pierre-Joseph Proudhon went further. Despite his radical critiques of property and exploitation, he dismissed early feminist demands as unnatural and even dangerous, deploying biological determinism in a way that later historians would describe as openly misogynistic. And these were not incidental prejudices. They revealed the limits of a socialism that could imagine equality in the workshop and the state, but not yet in the family or the home. And it was precisely this gap that early socialist feminists would seize upon. The night of March the 19th, 1848, was wet, warm, and full of promise. Jeanne Deroin stood with half a dozen other women in a small third-floor apartment, candlelight flickering against the stone walls. From the open window came the distant buzz of voices and song, Paris still humming with revolutionary possibility. The room was crowded, the air filled with smoke and excitement. Then Eugénie Niboyet burst through the door, a freshly printed newspaper held aloft in both hands. "Friends," she declared, breathless, "our voices will not be silenced." The room erupted. Jeanne craned her neck as the paper was spread across a splintered table. Eugénie bent low, holding a sputtering candle over the page, and Jeanne saw the title printed in bold black letters, La Voix de Femme, the woman's voice. Jeanne clasped Eugénie by the shoulder, and the two women exchanged a look of recognition, part joy, part disbelief. For years they had agitated, written, organized, educated, often ignored, often mocked. Now, for the first time, it felt possible that the working woman might finally claim a place in the new republic. Feminism in France is sometimes seen as something that emerged from socialism. But when we look more closely at the culture of radical reform in the 1830s and 40s, we see that from the very beginning, the two movements rose together, parallel responses to a world built on domination. Some of the earliest feminist voices of the French left emerged from a loose, experimental radical subculture, often labeled utopian socialism. Now, in the 1820s and 30s, these movements were not yet socialist in any formal sense, but they were among the first to insist that questions of labor, hierarchy, and gender could not be separated. One of the most influential of these circles was associated with the followers of Henri de Saint-Simon. Though later dismissed by critics as naive or elitist, the Saint-Simonians were unusual in their willingness to challenge not only private property and social inequality, but also the structure of the family itself. In their meetings and publications, women were treated, at least in theory, as moral and intellectual equals. Reforms to marriage, labor, and women's legal status were openly debated. Now, these spaces were imperfect and quite often contradictory, but they created something rare in early 19th century Europe, a political environment in which women could articulate radical critiques of both capitalism and patriarchy in their own voices. Out of this milieu emerged the first explicitly feminist currents of the French left. In 1832, a circle of women from varied backgrounds, many of whom had passed through the Saint-Simonian circles and grown frustrated with their hierarchies, launched La Femme Libre, the Free Woman, the first feminist periodical in France. Its contributors included writers and organizers like Eugénie Niboyet, Flora Tristan, and Jeanne Deroin, a labor activist and former seamstress, whose presence signaled that this was not merely an elite literary project, but a movement with deep roots in working-class life. Jeanne Deroin was a self-educated seamstress, journalist, and activist whose vision of gender, labor, and family anticipated many currents of modern feminism. Engaging directly with male socialist theorists like Pierre-Joseph Proudhon through public articles and private correspondence, Deroin rejected the idea that a woman's place in society could be reduced to a narrow set of roles: housewife, domestic servant, or sex worker. She drew attention to the vast realm of unpaid domestic labor that sustained both households and the broader economy, arguing that many women turned to paid service or sex work not out of moral failure, but because these were among the few forms of labor society was willing to recognize and compensate. In so doing, Deroin exposed a central contradiction within early socialism as a movement committed to guaranteeing work and dignity, yet one that would struggle to extend those promises to women in the revolutionary moment that followed. Jeanne Deroin was not alone in making such critiques. She was part of a much wider feminist current that included journalists and organizers like Eugénie Niboyet and the socialist writer Flora Tristan, all of whom insisted that any genuine social republic would have to confront gender as well as class. Throughout the 1840s, socialist feminists continued to agitate and educate amongst seamstresses, nurses, mothers, and sex workers. Their work was often mundane and full of drudgery, traveling from one cramped workshop to another. But 1848 would then open up new space and inspire hope for their cause. By March of that year, Jeanne Deroin, Eugénie Niboyet, and other socialist feminists would come together to found La Voix des Femmes, a daily periodical challenging the new republic to make good on its claims to equality and justice. This feminist organizing was part of a much wider shift. By the middle of the 1840s, socialist ideas had moved well beyond the cafes and journals of Paris's intellectual elite. They were now spreading into workshops, guilds, tenements, and workers' clubs. As economic conditions worsened after the famines of 1848, the social question was no longer just a matter for scholars. It had become a source of mounting social pressure, felt daily in work, wages, and survival. The February Revolution of 1848 brought these ideas, seemingly all at once, out of the margins and into the center of public life, into political clubs, newspapers, and the institutions of the new republic itself. And ultimately, it was this sudden visibility of the social question, even more than the uprising itself, that would prove to be the most explosive. Chapter 2. Springtime in Paris. A reactionary and oligarchical government has just been overthrown by the heroism of the people of Paris. The Provisional Government of the French Republic pledges itself to guarantee labor to all citizens. It decrees the immediate establishment of national workshops. Let us show that equality, liberty, and fraternity are at the same time the symbol of order. Proclamation of the French Provisional Government, February 1848. Interlude. While the ink was still wet. It was nearing midnight on February the 25th. The streets had grown quiet like a city holding its breath after days of noise. But in the print rooms of La Réforme, the air still buzzed with the mechanical clank of presses. Printers had worked nearly without pause for a week, racing to keep up with events that seemed to unfold faster than ink could dry. When one shift ended, new workers stepped in. The presses never fully stopped. The floor was slick with ink and sweat. Sheets lay stacked along the walls, curling at the edges, still warm to the touch. The headline prepared for the next morning read, "Louis-Philippe abdicates. A republic has been proclaimed. The people must now make it their own." Inside, the paper overflowed with editorials, proposals, and arguments, each attempting to sketch the future of the new republic before it had fully begun. One column called for calm and order. Another demanded the right to work. A third warned already against excess, against letting the streets dictate the terms of politics. Printers shouted corrections over the din. A compositor scratched out a sentence and reset the type. Someone argued that the word people was doing too much work. Which people? Someone else laughed and said that it didn't matter. Not tonight. One article struck a particularly hopeful note. Ledru Roland named Minister of the Interior. Louis Blanc, Minister of State. Friends of the people promise work and reform. For the editors of La Réforme, and for many of its readers, it felt as though the Republic was finally listening. But even here, amid the celebration, uncertainty crept in. The competing headlines betrayed a deeper unease about the nature of this new republic. Was it meant to guarantee bread, or merely the right to speak while hunger remained untouched? Bundles of freshly printed papers were tied with twine and carried out into the night, pressed into the hands of runners waiting in doorways. By morning, these pages would be everywhere, spread across cafe tables, read aloud in workshops, argued over in crowded political clubs, each copy carrying the same dangerous promise, that history was open once more. But how long it would stay open, no one in that room could say. In the weeks after the February Revolution, Paris was filled with cautious hope. A republic had been declared, and new freedoms of association, of the press, of speech were now said to be guaranteed. And even as the provisional government's more moderate leaders proved hesitant to disrupt the existing social order, the upheaval had unmistakably opened space for new and radical ideas to flourish. Socialists of every stripe rushed to fill that space. From the reformer Louis Blanc to the insurrectionist Auguste Blanqui, from the patriarchal anarchist Pierre-Joseph Proudhon to the working-class feminist Jeanne Deroin. Their competing visions, reform, revolution, agitation, and mutual aid, would define the ideological spring of 1848. For a brief moment, it appeared as though this ideological diversity might coexist within the new republic itself. The provisional government formed in February was an uneasy coalition bringing together moderate Republicans, democratic socialists, and a small but symbolically powerful socialist minority. Its public face, figures like the poet-statesman Alphonse de Lamartine promised order, legality, and national unity. But alongside them sat men who believed the republic would be meaningless unless it addressed the material suffering that had driven the uprising in the first place. Among these were the democratic socialists, often referred to as the Montagnards, who drew consciously on the Jacobin legacy of 1793. Leaders like Alexandre Ledru-Rollin, founder of the radical leftist paper La Réforme, argued that political liberty without social justice was a hollow victory. And then at the far edge of the provisional government stood Louis Blanc, whose presence signaled, at least temporarily, that the social question had now entered the halls of power. for workers flooding the streets and clubs of Paris. This fragile arrangement felt promising and initially signaled that the Republic might become not only political, but social as well. As a gesture of reconciliation, the provisional government declared a general amnesty for political prisoners. Radical journalists, Republican conspirators, and socialist agitators were released, including the imprisoned leaders of the failed 1839 uprising, Auguste Blanqui and Armand Barbès. After nearly a decade behind bars, Blanqui emerged more uncompromising than ever. Prison had not dulled his revolutionary fire, it had sharpened it. He now openly called himself a socialist, committed to overthrowing the bourgeois order and establishing a dictatorship on behalf of the working class. Upon release, he formed the Central Republican Society, one of dozens of political clubs that sprang up in revolutionary Paris in the spring of 1848. Blanqui's reputation as an unyielding conspirator drew many radicals, including fellow amnesty recipients. Having lived through the betrayals of 1830, 1832, and 1839, Blanqui no longer trusted the Republic's liberal leaders. While others debated policy, he and his followers began preparing for their next insurrection. Louis Blanc took a different path. He joined the provisional government as a representative of working-class interests, determined to push for reform from within. Though most of his colleagues, men like Lamartine, were moderate liberals opposed to social revolution, they still understood the urgency of the social question. Just days after the Republic had been declared, armed workers had stormed the government chamber, demanding the organization of labor and the right to work. Their message was clear. Without material change, the new regime risked losing the workers who had fought to create it. Louis Blanc was tasked with addressing the workers' demands. A labor commission was established at the Luxembourg Palace, and he began organizing national workshops, publicly funded programs meant to provide jobs for the unemployed while improving infrastructure. But the project was undermined from the start. Despite Blanc's position, the Assembly appointed Émile Thomas, a moderate with little sympathy for socialism, to oversee implementation. This appointment signaled that the workshops were not seen as the basis of a new order, but instead as a temporary bandage to contain unrest. While Blanc tried to reform the state and Blanqui planned to overthrow it, others organized outside it. Jeanne Deroin, a former seamstress turned activist, helped launch La Voix des Femmes, the Woman's Voice, a feminist socialist newspaper and political club. Many had assumed the new republic would extend universal suffrage, but it quickly became clear that universal meant male only. Women who had fought and died on the barricades of February were once again excluded from the very republic they had helped to create. The Woman's Voice, first published in March, became the epicenter of the 1848 women's rights movement. Deroin and her comrades demanded the right to vote, access to education, labor protections, equal pay, and personal autonomy. But they faced steep resistance. Their papers were mocked in the press, their meetings harassed, and by June, most feminist publications had been shut down, victims of both official censorship and unofficial repression. Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, the insurgent philosopher of the revolution, took a different approach still. Suspicious of all forms of state power, even revolutionary ones, Proudhon called for a decentralized economy built on mutual aid and workers' self-management. We want the mines, canals, railways handed over to democratically organized workers' associations, he declared, a vast federation of companies and societies joined together in the common bond of the democratic and social republic. He opposed the national workshops, which he saw as a top-down program administered by the same apparatus he hoped to dismantle. But Proudhon, too, faced criticism. His vision of equality did not extend to women. Feminists like Deroin called out the patriarchal blind spots of his anarchism, which refused to acknowledge women as full political actors. By early summer, the cracks in the Republic were widening. Blanqui's followers were preparing for confrontation. Blanc's workshops were overflowing and viewed with suspicion by conservatives. Feminist clubs were under siege, and Proudhon's rejection of both reform and revolution was beginning to gain traction. In the wake of the revolution, Paris had become a city full of demands. but there was no consensus on how to meet these demands. And so the hopeful promise of spring quickly hardened into bitter disillusionment by summer. One of the most striking features of the 1848 revolution was the speed of its transformation. The cycle echoed past revolutions. In 1789, a popular uprising gave way to disillusionment by 1794. In 1830, hope eroded into repression by 1832. But in 1848, the entire arc, from insurrection to reaction, unfolded in just 5 months. By May, the true character of the Second Republic was beginning to show. A national election had been held in late April under universal male suffrage, the most democratic vote since 1792, though still excluding women. Rural voters from the provinces overwhelmingly chose conservative delegates who viewed Parisian radicals with open contempt. One of the Assembly's first actions was to dismantle Blanc's Labor Commission. The workshops had been active for less than 2 months, and already their leadership had been undermined by Émile Thomas. But to the Assembly, they were costly, wasteful, and dangerous. So the Labor Commission was abolished almost immediately. Louis Blanc was stripped of power, reduced to an isolated voice on the Assembly floor, one of just 2 socialists alongside his ally Albert the Worker, now little more than a token. In response to the Assembly's hard turn right, radicals organized a peaceful demonstration on May the 15th. But what began as a protest spiraled into a spontaneous occupation of the Palais Bourbon. Protesters declared a new provisional government, naming Auguste Blanqui and Louis Blanc among its ministers. But unlike in February, the National Guard did not defect. The occupation was short-lived, troops cleared the hall, and arrests quickly followed. The aftermath was catastrophic for the revolutionary left. Its most unifying leaders, Blanqui, Barbès, were imprisoned. The government seized the opportunity to then launch a broad crackdown. By June, radical clubs and newspapers were being shut down en masse. This included feminist publications like The Women's Voice, as well as clubs like Blanqui's Central Republican Society. The purge extended beyond the most radical voices, silencing anyone to the left of the Assembly majority. As part of this repression, the national workshops were blamed for stoking unrest among Paris's unemployed. Debate over their abolition intensified. Then, on June the 21st, the Assembly issued its decree. The workshops were to be shut down. Thousands of desperate men, many of them recent arrivals, were told there would be no work. To make matters worse, the government ordered all able-bodied men under 25 to either enlist in the army or leave Paris for rural labor. Within 2 days, Paris would erupt once more. Chapter 3. The June Days. A quote from Karl Marx's The Class Struggles in France. The June insurrection in Paris was the first great battle between the two classes which split modern society. Interlude. 4 days in Saint-Antoine. Jacques Bonhomme was no longer sure he liked Paris. When he had first arrived, the city had dazzled him. The arcades, the columns, the monuments, the palaces. He had spent nearly a week just walking, dazed and barefoot, stupefied by the lights and the gnawing in his stomach. But now the gas lamps no longer twinkled like stars. They burned like suns, hot and sleepless, keeping him awake at night. The dream had faded into something harsher. Still, Jacques was thankful to have work. Back in Vendôme, he had become a burden, a mouth to feed with no sheep left to shear and no harvest left to gather. He missed the quiet thickets and winding streams of home. He couldn't afford a room in Paris, so he slept in the parks, like hundreds of others. Older workers told him to be grateful. At least it's spring, they said. Winter'll drive you mad. That morning, Jacques woke with the red sun rising through the cherry blossoms. Already dressed, he slept in his work clothes. He pulled on his boots, rubbed his eyes, and walked toward the site. He wasn't sure what day it was. Late June, maybe. The streets were full of men like him, trudging across the grass. He found it strange how many of them were fixing the very parks they slept in. He couldn't decide if that was beautiful or terrible. Digging, that's what they did. Check in, dig, get paid. But the city was overflowing now, and more often than not, they were 10 men digging a single hole. No one could say what the holes were for. Jacques once joked they were either building the future or digging their own graves. But that morning, something was off. The usual rhythm, shovels, hammering, orders, was gone. In its place, murmuring, raised voices, someone shouting for calm. A group of men passed him, walking away from the site. "What's happened?" Jacques asked. "They've shut it down," one said. "The bastards cut us off," another muttered. Jacques froze. The work had been monotonous, but at least it was something, a rhythm, a wage, bread for dinner. Now it was gone. He felt the old sensation rising in his gut, the one from Vendôme, when the last grain sack emptied and the sheep froze in the fields. Hunger was coming. The next few days passed in a blur. Jacques caught bits of news in fragments and rumors. A fellow worker told him the assembly had voted to close the national workshops. Jacques had voted in the recent election, his first, but he wasn't that surprised. Back home, people hated Paris. He assumed the rest of France felt the same. But the most shocking news came that afternoon when a printer visited the park. "They want us gone," the man said. "Anyone under 25, join the army or leave the city." Jacques was 19. He was no soldier, but he was not going back to Vendôme. He knew what awaited him there. "We don't have to accept this," the printer said. "We're going to demonstrate tomorrow. We did it in February, we can do it again." Jacques hadn't been in Paris in February, only heard rumors. If he was honest, he was afraid. "Meet at the Club de Saint-Antoine," the printer continued. "First thing in the morning. You won't need anything but your shovel, but if you can find a rifle, even better." The printer handed Jacques a flyer. Jacques passed it to a friend. He couldn't read. The next morning, Jacques and most of the others walked to Saint-Antoine. None of them knew exactly what to expect, but they all seemed to share the same thought. What else was there to do? That day was full of sweat, shouting, and sudden movement. Jacques found himself swept up in a sea of anger. He chanted without knowing the words. He followed without knowing the plan. That night, an old man whispered that soldiers had been spotted moving into the city. "They're going to start arresting people," he said. "Now it's fight or end up in a cell." A gaunt man with a long rifle began organizing defenses. Jacques was told to enter a cafe and carry out every table and chair. He hesitated. Whose chairs were these? But everyone else was doing it, so he just followed orders. Early the next morning, Jacques climbed atop the barricades he had helped build. He looked down the boulevard. Dozens more had gone up in the night, a cascade of makeshift walls as far as the eye could see. Some were made of paving stones, others of wood and broken furniture. He found that he was dazzled once more. These people are crazy, he thought. They're walling off the entire city. Over the next 2 days, Jacques changed. He had been a farmer, then a worker, now he was a soldier. At first, he had no weapon. He hunkered down in the cafe carrying the wounded. A woman in a red bonnet, maybe a nurse, maybe just someone helping, organized them as best she could. Then someone handed him a dead man's rifle. He took it, left the cafe, took cover behind the barricade. On the third day, someone whispered that the Archbishop of Paris was coming to mediate. "That priest is mad," someone said. Jacques said nothing. He'd always respected the church, but Paris clearly had sharper lines. On the final day, word spread that Saint-Antoine was one of the last neighborhoods holding out. That night, Jacques peered over the barricade. By the light of the gas lamps, he saw them. Hundreds of soldiers. Their uniforms gleamed in contrast to the rags of the insurgents. Jacques was amazed by the people around him, men and women who threw themselves into the fire without hesitation. He stayed low. He figured he was worth more alive than dead. By the end of the fourth day, they were overrun. When the National Guard seized him, Jacques did not resist. He told himself he'd take their offer, join the army. Like a rag doll, he let himself be dragged limp across the cobblestones, thinking only one thing: at least I'm not dead. The June Days uprising lasted only 4 days, but its memory would echo for decades. Over 3,000 workers and civilians were killed. More than 11,000 were arrested. Thousands were deported to far-off colonies. Whole neighborhoods were crushed beneath artillery, and with them the last hopes of a working-class republic in 1848. Karl Marx would later call it, quote, "the first great battle between the two classes which split modern society. Not a fight between monarchy and republic, but a fight between two kinds of republic. one that preserved property, and one that sought to abolish class rule altogether. The bourgeois republic had triumphed, but the meaning of that victory, Marx warned, would only become clear after the cheering stopped. In the short term, June marked the death of socialist agitation in Paris. Radical clubs were dismantled, newspapers silenced. The tricolor flag waved once more, but now over a republic that promised order, not justice. Yet the fire of February did not stay contained. In 1848, revolutions erupted across Europe, from Berlin to Vienna, Milan to Budapest, Warsaw to Bucharest. This was the so-called springtime of the peoples, remembered in national myths as a great awakening of liberal and nationalist consciousness. But it was more than that. In every uprising, from France to Germany to Italy, the revolutions were also about bread, about unemployment, about evictions and enclosures, about the rising price of flour and the disappearing promise of dignity. They were social revolutions, at least at first. And in nearly every case, they were crushed. The names and timelines varied, but the pattern was unmistakable. When the moment came, the liberal bourgeoisie, those who called for freedom of the press, for constitutions, for the end of feudal privilege, chose to side with monarchs, generals, and landlords over the workers in the streets. For the foundational generation of socialists, figures like Friedrich Engels, Mikhail Bakunin, and many others who fought on the barricades, 1848 was not a romantic memory. It was a trauma, a betrayal, a political awakening, yes, but not the one the liberals had hoped for. It was the moment when the masks came off, the moment when the enemies of privilege were no longer just kings and priests, but also Republicans in waistcoats and cravats, who voted for freedom with one hand and signed deportation orders with the other. And in that revelation, socialism was no longer just a hope. It became a necessity. Epilogue: An anarchist in the halls of power. Sound had a strange way of moving through the Palais Bourbon. Every scuff of polished leather, every clink of a silver-tipped cane echoed across the marble chamber like a bell. These sounds seemed designed to remind Pierre-Joseph Proudhon of his own boots. Heavy, work-worn, and utterly out of place. He knew the other delegates noticed, but that was the point. He wasn't one of them, and he wanted them to feel it. As he climbed the marble stairs to the rostrum, he passed beneath carved neoclassical figures frozen in scenes of civic virtue. Solemn men engaged in calm debate, like actors in some idealized Roman drama. Proudhon could still smell the gunpowder on his jacket. The blood from the June Days uprising, just weeks earlier, hadn't yet dried in the streets. This place had been built to intimidate men like him, to cast doubt on their legitimacy before they even spoke. But he would speak anyway. "Citizen representatives," he began, "you are impatient, not to hear me, but to be done with me. Socialism has been agitating the people for 20 years. Socialism made the February Revolution. Your parliamentary quarrels would not have shaken the masses. Socialism figured in all the acts of the revolution." Already, murmurs were spreading through the chamber, a few laughs, a heckle from the far corner. It was socialism that served as the banner of the last insurrection, and it is with socialism that you want to put an end, by forcing it to explain itself at this tribune. I too want to put an end to it, and since you have guaranteed me freedom of speech, it will not be up to me whether we end with socialism or with something else. The murmurs grew louder, jeers now, scattered but sharp. Proudhon did not flinch, not because he couldn't hear them, but because he knew they were meant to distract, to put him on the defensive. "They want to crush in me socialism itself," he said. "That is to say, the protest of the working class. But this is not a duel between me and Citizen Thiers. This is a conflict between labor and privilege." He saw Adolphe Thiers begin to stir at the sound of his name. Proudhon tightened his grip on the rostrum. He could not afford to lose the floor. "The revolution of 1848 has arrived," he declared. "Its dangers, its anxieties, though different in kind, are no less real than those of 1793. In 1793, the enemy was despotism and foreign invasion. In 1848, it is pauperism, the division of the people into two nations, those who possess and those who do not. The aims of the revolution have been named in many ways. the extinction of poverty, the organization of labor, harmony between capital and work, the emancipation of the proletariat, most recently, the right to work. Sneers rippled through the chamber. Political equality cannot survive in a republic ruled by capital, Proudhon warned. Either property will destroy the republic, or the republic will destroy property. That line broke the chamber. Laughter erupted across the floor. Shouts, jeers, the kind of ridicule meant not to argue with an idea, but to bury it. Proudhon stood firm. As the noise rose, he glanced to his left and caught the eye of Louis Blanc. They had clashed often, bitterly, over the past few months. But in that moment, in this hall, surrounded by sneers and silence, there was something like recognition between them. They were all that was left of the social republic, the reformer and the anarchist, both ghosts now, speaking to a room that no longer wanted to listen. "I am sorry, citizens," Proudhon said, "that what I say makes you laugh so much, because what I say here will kill you." He had been accused before of hiding his beliefs, of muting his radicalism once inside the halls of power. But here, at the height of the backlash, he laid it bare. Yes, he did want the abolition of property, but not through violence, not through confiscation, through peaceful structural reform, through the slow and deliberate revocation of privilege. "I propose," he said, "a temporary income tax by which workers and employers might resume their positions, depreciated property regain its value, and public credit be founded on new terms." Proudhon was not calling for blood in the streets. He was calling for a radical shift in how society valued labor and wealth. For him, the problem was not just inequality. It was that the very structure of ownership made equality impossible. The assembly was not interested. They would censor him the next day. But beyond the gilded hall, past the velvet benches and marble columns, there were others listening. Not that day, not in that room, but in the workshops, on the barricades, and in the minds of those who had not yet given up on a social republic. Proudhon's speech wasn't just defiant, it was clarifying. He was drawing a line between two visions of the republic, one built to preserve the privileges of property, and one that demanded economic justice as the foundation of democracy. For him, the very existence of vast private wealth, earned not through labor but through rent, speculation, or inheritance, was incompatible with the ideals of liberty and equality. His proposal for a special income tax was not about punishing the rich for being rich. It was about beginning the peaceful, legal dismantling of a system that concentrated power in the hands of a few. In calling for the abolition of property, Proudhon did not mean the theft of personal belongings. He meant ending a structure where wealth reproduces itself through exploitation. In 1848, this was heresy. But by 1871, when the Paris Commune tried to build a new society on the ruins of the old, the ideas of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon would no longer seem so outlandish. In fact, they would be foundational. The Revolution of 1848 in Paris would become the epicenter of a social earthquake whose tremors were felt across Europe and beyond, from Berlin to Budapest, Rome to Bucharest, and even as far as Montevideo. Each uprising unfolded under its own local conditions, but nearly all carried the same unresolved tensions that had exploded on the streets of Paris during the June days. New political orders emerged, some constitutional, some authoritarian, some barely holding together. But almost none addressed the social crisis that had driven the revolutions in the first place: hunger, inequality, and the dislocations of industrial capitalism. Political reform advanced, but social reform did not. In the months that followed, the pattern repeated itself across the continent. Workers, women, and radicals were pushed out of political life through repression, mass arrests, censorship, and exile. What had briefly seemed like a continental spring hardened into a long reaction. And yet, the defeat of 1848 did not end the struggle. It simply scattered it. An entire generation of radicals was forced into motion, across borders, across languages, across empires. In cities like Geneva, London, and New York, exiles began to regroup, carrying with them the lessons of both hope and betrayal. And so, out of the ashes of 1848, a new idea would begin to take shape, that the struggle could not succeed within any nation alone, that workers' emancipation would have to be international, or it would be crushed everywhere. From this conviction would emerge the International Workingmen's Association, the first international, shaped by figures forged in the defeats of 1848, Friedrich Engels, Mikhail Bakunin, and Karl Marx. So, in our next episode, we turn to that project, and to the question that would define a new era of the left. What is internationalism? The dream of a global working class.
Mais je l'ai bien cru, les temps des séries, où l'on s'en va de, puis mon rêve du pendant de rêve. Séries éternellement, heureux à pareil, du bon sur les mous, sans goutte de sang. Mais je l'ai bien cru, les temps de séries.
ISM is written and produced by me, Matt Payne. The original musical score is composed by Ian Payne. Our theme song is performed by Aloe Vera on vocals and banjo, with accompaniment from Ian and myself. If you're curious how I build these narrative scenes, where I source the quotes, what lines are verbatim, altered, or composed to capture the essence of a moment, you'll find full transcripts, suggested readings, show notes, and behind-the-scenes looks at my process on the ISM Substack. The link is in the episode description. To learn more about Ian's work, you'll also find his website there. And if you'd like to reach out, you can email me at ismhistorypodcast@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening, and I will see you next time.